Welcome to the Alyosha Society, where we are pursuing truth, beauty, and goodness through great literature. And we are about to start a new one, but you knew that. New shirt, new book. You like the white? Thought it would go great. Jane Austen. That's right, yeah. So we're starting Northanger Abbey. First video right here of, drumroll please, 12. That's right. And the way I've got it mapped out, we're going to do 3 intro videos. 3. Yeah, I know. We're really taking that historical biographical approach thing really seriously here. So 3 videos doing all the background material, Jane Austen's life in the early 19th century, all those things. And then the 4th video will get into the novel. So what that does is that allows you to go ahead and kind of get a jump on the reading. Because it'll be a while before we actually get into the story. So without further ado, we got a lot to talk about. So let's get right to it. I love this novel, and you're going to see that. I love this author too. I think you're going to see that coming out. There we go. You know why? Mysterious. Kind of edgy. Haunted houses with lightning and thunder and bats. Yeah. Gothic. Oh yeah. All of that and more in Northanger Abbey. Yeah, you didn't know Jane Austen wrote this kind of stuff, did you? All right, well, she did. And we're going to have a lot of fun talking about this unusual Jane Austen novel. I will say this, of her 6 big novels, this one's kind of different than the others. It is kind of different than the others. That, my friends, is a picture of the protagonist of the story, Catherine Morland, and she's reading a book, as you can see. That's important, but I'm not going to tell you why yet. We are sticking to our story. What is our story of understanding books? The same keys that I've been teaching you in every other book. Historical, biographical approach. It's just that with this Jane Austen novel, we are going to do it up. We're really going to do it up. We're going to be looking at Jane Austen's life quite a bit. The reason for writing this novel is going to be one of the things that we talk about over and over and over. And to whom was she writing? Oh, that's part of the fun here. What was the time period? Actually late 18th century, early 19th century. Austen was born in 1775, so we'll talk about that. And then we're going to be all over genre like white on rice. And I hope you noticed right up there at the top what kind of novel this is, genre-wise. It's a new one. Yeah, we've done all kinds of genres so far, but we've never done a parody novel. A parody novel. A parody novel is basically a novel that's making fun of something. That's what Northanger Abbey is. More on that to come. But for now, I want to get right to the time period. And I hope that this is a very familiar slide to you. I've talked quite a bit about how in the world did we get to where we are today in terms of our culture. But I'm also using the same slide to explain where the different, we've done Rousseau's Social Contract. We've done Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, Pilgrim's Progress. Where does it fit in the flow and development of ideas? So we know medieval man was largely what? You remember? In his little worldview car, largely a Christian worldview. But that Christian worldview experiences 3 big old speed bumps in the tunnel. This is an old slide. You've seen it several times. The car goes through the tunnel and it hits 3 speed bumps. The Renaissance, that is a rebirth and a kind of a renewed interest in Greco-Roman culture and art and life and literature. Then the Reformation, 16th century, which puts emphasis on the individual. And then this is going to get even more and more important in the books that we're going to be reading and talking about, the Enlightenment. We did talk about that quite a bit with Rousseau. What is the Enlightenment? Hang tight. We're going to do a review of that in a minute. But when the worldview car comes out the other side, what do we have, friends? Yeah, well, we don't have medieval man anymore. We have modern man. Modern man thinks, acts, sees the world very differently than medieval man over there on the left. So after Michelangelo's David, emphasis on humanism, what can the individual do? Martin Luther's emphasis on individual interpretation of scripture. And then we have Voltaire. We have a lot of French thinkers here. We have Rousseau, who any of whom could represent the Enlightenment. Now, what were the ideals of the Enlightenment? Do you remember? This ought to look fairly familiar to you. First of all, it's an 18th century movement, which means it's mostly in the 1700s. That doesn't mean it began one day and ended another day, friends. Movements like the Enlightenment or the Reformation or the Renaissance, they happen over hundreds of years, and they fade in and they fade out, and maybe they don't ever really totally go away. They're just general ways of thinking of the culture in that time period. So what characterizes the Enlightenment? We said my final authority is now not so much the Bible as it would have been for medieval man, but reason. My own ability to think things through, use the scientific method, and figure it out. It was even called we even call it the age of reason. There's a huge emphasis now on human progress. Man, look at what we can do. There's eventually going to be all these, new inventions and new ways of thinking about government and culture and art. And when we did Rousseau, we talked about government as a social contract. Guys, that was earth-shattering when the medieval system focuses more on feudal lords, the feudal system, divine right of kings. We talked about all that in the 17th century. All of that changes, and so does the view of God. Enlightenment thinkers didn't see God as someone who was involved in this world, but rather a God who created the world and then just kind of let it go. Sort of the absentee landlord concept, the clockmaker, wind her up and let her go. That is called deism. So take a screenshot, friends. You need to know these. These are the primary ideas of the Enlightenment, and most of the authors that we're going to be reading are in some way influenced by this way of thinking. So be sure you got that. Let's take a look a little bit more at historical philosophical context for Jane Austen. So we already said we've got Enlightenment in the 18th century, but I want to go ahead and start moving us forward a little bit. The Enlightenment of the 18th century is going to kind of give way to a new way of thinking in the 19th century. Once again, would be the 1800s. That's primarily when Jane Austen's writing, called Romanticism. Romanticism. And you know what, guys? History tends to be pendulum swings. That's right. We kind of get all nutty about one idea, and then we realize, oh yeah, we kind of went too far with that. And then we swing the pendulum back, and almost never do we come up with a nice sort of even-keeled, middle-of-the-road position. We swing the pendulum back. So Romanticism is going to swing that pendulum. The culture is going to kind of react against reason, the deism, some of these ideas, and it's going to go in definitely too far in the other direction. Okay, well, what is that other direction? I'm going to show you in the next slide. But before we get there, I want to point out, this is so important, friends. Austen is born right at it's like the hinges of the door, the fulcrum. She's born right at the time when Enlightenment was kind of giving way to Romanticism. So she's going to be growing up with dueling banjos, sort of. She's going to be growing up with the culture kind of throwing both of these snowballs at her. Well, what's the other snowball? Romanticism. All right. First of all, it's more of a 19th century movement. And folks started to think, hey, it's not all about head knowledge, man. I'm human too. And so the culture started to emphasize feelings and emotion as the final authority in obtaining truth, as opposed to just, cold, dead, scientific reason. Romanticism said man is basically good and his progress is inevitable. That's like the rallying cry of Romanticism. Man is basically good, as opposed to what Scripture says, that he is not basically good. He's basically sinful. And his progress, he's just going to keep getting better and better. Very much an evolutionary kind of view of mankind. He's always on this upward trajectory. There's an emphasis on nature. Oh, the poetry of the Romantic era praises the beauties of nature. And I'm not saying that's all bad. I'm just saying that's what it was. There are lots of different views of God. There were certainly still deists during this time. There were certainly theistic Christians, evangelicals, that believe some of the things that the evangelical church believes today. There also is this idea of pantheism, because when you're focusing so much on nature, pantheism is the idea that God is basically everything, and he's in everything. So you worship the trees and you worship the rivers and the mountains and the sun and the stars because God is everything. But the main emphasis I want you to get is head versus heart. Enlightenment, Romanticism. You got that? Okay, that's very important. So let's go back to the slide before this. You see, the fact that Austen is living when one of these is giving way to the other is very important in the historical biographical approach in reading her novels. Because again, it's like, the snowballs. She's got both of these coming at her, and the culture is telling her head, heart, head, heart. And she's got to wrestle with that. And she was a Christian. She was raised in a Christian home. Her dad was a minister. So she's got to work through that biblically. And we'll talk about that when we get to Northanger Abbey. Now, I wanted to pause here. I haven't done this yet, but I thought this would be a good time to do a timeline of all the books that we've done so far. Just so you can kind of, it's always good to see the big picture, see the forest before we dive down into the trees. So I'm going to kind of do these in chronological order, not necessarily in the order that we did them. But we did talk about Paradise Lost, late 17th century, 1670s. John Milton, remember we did that poetry unit. We did Pilgrim's Progress, which was published in 1678. 1678, John Bunyan. Remember we talked about the English Civil War, Charles I beheaded in 1649. Oh, several decades after the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock and all that. So we talked about the 17th century. We did some Anne Bradstreet poetry, 1670s. So she's also late 17th century. Really, really enjoyed doing Anne Bradstreet with you guys. And we did Gulliver's Travels. Remember, Gulliver's Travels was published a few decades later in 1726 or 7, is it? Yeah. I'm going by memory here. It's either 1726 or 1727, but several decades later. But the whole, Whigs versus Tories and all the silly things that he's lampooning and mocking, that's early 18th century. Jonathan Swift, remember we talked about him and his life. Then we came up to 1762. Jean-Jacques Rousseau publishes The Social Contract. Remember, he wanted to be a musician. He ends up being famous for political philosophy. Social Contract, really enjoy that. So where does our new book fit? Okay, well, notice it's a pretty big jump up here. It was written in 1803, so it was one of the first novels that Austen wrote, but here's the crazy thing. It was one of the last to be published. So it wasn't published until after she was dead. I'm going to show you the dates for that a little bit later. So I think it was published in 1818, and Austen died in 1817. So it was published after her death, but she actually wrote it in 1803. So I just kind of stuck the arrow in there in a place that I thought would be appropriate. The point is early 19th century. Bam, there it is, guys. There it is. Those are the books we've covered so far. You can see them in context. So here we go. I alluded to this earlier, but I wanted to give you the big picture. Not one, not two. Oh, yes, friends. 3 introduction videos. You're welcome. We're going to be covering a ton of stuff in the other 2 videos. Then in the 4th video, you can see the breakdown of the chapters. It's either going to be 3 or 4 chapters per video. I kind of tried to balance it out. All right, take a screenshot of that. Be sure you got it. White shirt, new book, new century, new philosophical focus of the culture. There's a lot of exciting things going on right now. All right, 2 more introduction videos. See you in the next one, friends.